Hey, stop right there. Don't move. Hands where I can see them.
I'm Deputy U.S. Marshal Marcus Reed. I'm traveling on official orders.
That uniform doesn't mean anything to me. Show me something real.
I can give you my credentials and orders.
Put the bag down.
Please verify through dispatch or a supervisor.
You're detained.
Officer Ethan Crowley believed he was dealing with a fake, another guy trying to look important in a busy airport. He figured it would be simple. Stop him, check him, search his bag, prove he didn't belong, and send him on his way embarrassed. What Crowley didn't understand was that the man standing in front of him wasn't pretending to be law enforcement. He was a deputy U.S. Marshal on official orders, and the moment Crowley decided to escalate, he turned a routine contact into a recorded civil rights incident. Before we rewind, where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments. And if you like stories where arrogance meets documentation and accountability, hit like and subscribe, because this one ends with consequences. This started inside Denver International Airport during a stretch of heavy foot traffic where people were rushing between gates and nobody had patience for delays. Crowley and his partner, Officer Kyle Benton, were working patrol in the terminal. They weren't at a checkpoint. This was the public side of the airport, where officers rely on discretion, quick judgments, and constant scanning for anything that looks off. Marcus Reed didn't look off. He looked official. Reed moved through the terminal in a formal U.S. Marshal uniform, carrying a travel bag and paperwork for an official assignment. He wasn't showing off. He wasn't looking for attention. He had the posture of someone used to airports, used to procedures, and used to getting from one point to the next without drama. Crowley stepped into his path and stopped him anyway. Crowley demanded Reed's identification and immediately treated the uniform as suspicious. Instead of asking routine verification questions, he framed it like an accusation. Reed responded the way trained federal officers do in public. Calm tone, controlled movements, hands visible, credentials presented without arguing. Crowley didn't accept what he was looking at. Reed provided his marshal credentials and travel documentation and indicated he was traveling under official orders. The simple next step was obvious. Confirm through proper channels, call a supervisor, verify the credentials, and let him continue. Reed's demeanor made it easier, not harder. He didn't posture. He didn't get loud. He kept it professional. Crowley pushed harder. He demanded Reed's bag and insisted on searching it right there. Reed didn't refuse in a confrontational way, but he didn't surrender his rights or the process either. He kept offering the clean, standard solution: verify his identity through dispatch and a supervisor, then handle any necessary checks the right way. Crowley took that as resistance. Benton stayed close beside Crowley. He didn't calm the situation down. He didn't step in with a moderating voice. He backed Crowley's body language and let Crowley drive the contact. People around them started watching. Airports have a lot of noise, but tension stands out. A uniformed man being pressed by two officers catches attention fast. Travelers slowed down. Someone pulled out a phone. Then another person did the same from a different angle. Crowley had body cameras. Reed had paperwork. The public had cameras too. Crowley kept talking as if Reed's credentials were a prop. The comments turned from suspicion into something uglier. He implied Reed didn't match what a real marshal should be. He suggested the uniform was stolen or fake. The tone carried that familiar message without needing a speech. Crowley wasn't evaluating evidence. He was evaluating whether Reed looked like he belonged in the role. Reed stayed steady. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make sudden moves. He didn't give Crowley any excuse to claim he felt threatened. He kept his hands visible and his responses brief. That kind of self-control doesn't come from being timid. It comes from knowing how quickly a situation can be rewritten if you give the wrong person an opening. Crowley escalated anyway. He announced he was detaining Reed and moved in as if Reed had done something dangerous. Reed complied. No swinging arms, no pulling away, no attempt to run. Compliance didn't slow Crowley down. Crowley forced Reed to the ground in front of the crowd and put him in handcuffs while bystanders recorded and his body camera captured everything. Reed stayed on the floor, controlled and silent, waiting for the only thing that mattered now: verification through someone who would actually look at facts. That's when Sergeant Alicia Moreno arrived. Sergeant Alicia Moreno walked up into a scene that already looked bad from a distance. A man in a formal U.S. Marshal uniform was on the floor in handcuffs. Two airport officers were standing over him like they'd just stopped a threat. People had formed a loose ring around the situation, and several phones were up recording. Moreno didn't waste time trying to look tough. She went straight to information. Crowley started talking immediately, trying to control the story. He framed Reed like an imposter, acted like the stop had been justified, and tried to make Reed's calm compliance sound suspicious. Benton stood with him, backing the posture, letting Crowley narrate. Moreno focused on Reed. Reed kept the same controlled demeanor. He indicated he had already provided credentials and travel documentation and had asked for proper verification. He didn't plead. He didn't perform. He stayed professional because he knew the first supervisor who actually checked facts would end this. Moreno requested Reed's marshal credentials and orders. Within seconds, the difference between suspicion and reality became obvious. The identification was legitimate. The documentation matched. The travel orders checked out. Reed wasn't a civilian with a costume. He was a deputy U.S. Marshal traveling on official business, exactly as he had said from the start. Moreno's tone shifted from manage a situation to stop a mistake. She ordered Reed uncuffed immediately. Crowley hesitated. Not because he lacked the ability to follow instructions, but because uncuffing Reed meant admitting the whole contact had been wrong. Moreno didn't give him room to negotiate. She repeated the order and directed the removal of the cuffs right there in front of the crowd that had watched the takedown. Reed got up slowly and deliberately. No sudden movements, no gestures, just dignity. Moreno separated the officers from Reed and kept the contact controlled. She asked quick questions, confirmed the timeline, and made it clear she wasn't accepting vague officer safety explanations after the fact. Crowley tried to justify the escalation. Moreno didn't argue with him in public. She treated it like what it was: a supervisor securing the scene, gathering basic facts, and preventing further damage. Reed stayed composed and did what most people don't even think to do in the moment. He documented. He requested that all recordings be preserved, including body camera footage, airport surveillance, and any officer reports generated. He didn't threaten. He didn't posture. He simply made it clear that the record mattered and that he expected it to be handled correctly. That request landed differently because of who he was. Reed wasn't guessing at policy. He lived inside procedure. Moreno called for higher command. Chief Daniel Hartman responded after the initial verification came back. By the time he arrived, the crowd had thinned, but the phones had already captured enough. Hartman didn't treat it like a misunderstanding to smooth over. He treated it like an operational failure with legal consequences. Hartman spoke with Moreno first, then with Reed. Reed provided his credentials again and the travel documentation, and Hartman confirmed what Moreno had already established. Reed's identity was legitimate, his orders were legitimate, and the detention had no reasonable basis once credentials were presented. Hartman's next steps were immediate and administrative, not emotional. He pulled Crowley and Benton off duty on the spot. He directed that all body camera footage be preserved without delay. He instructed supervisors to secure any airport surveillance that captured the incident. He ordered that no one involved write creative summaries after the fact. Reports would be written, but the footage would be the anchor. Crowley tried to push back, not loudly, but in the way officers sometimes do when they realize they're about to lose control of the narrative. Hartman shut it down. Crowley and Benton were done for the day. Reed didn't celebrate. He didn't make a scene. He didn't have to. He left with his dignity intact. But the damage was already real. He'd been taken to the floor and cuffed in public while wearing a federal uniform. And the reason wasn't confusion. It was assumption. People had watched it happen. Cameras had captured it. That kind of moment doesn't disappear when the cuffs come off. Over the next hours, the incident didn't stay inside the terminal. Bystander videos started circulating. The body camera footage was now evidence. Hartman's decision to preserve everything meant this wouldn't turn into a he said, she said. It would turn into a review of what happened, what was said, and why two officers felt comfortable treating a confirmed federal officer like a suspect. Internal Affairs was triggered almost immediately because it had to be. A public takedown with questionable justification, racially loaded remarks on camera, and a detained deputy U.S. Marshal creates a tension that local leadership can't contain. And that attention didn't stop at the airport department. Federal scrutiny followed because Reed wasn't just any traveler. He was part of a federal law enforcement agency with its own standards, its own legal teams, and its own expectations when one of its people gets treated like that. By the time the first formal requests for records and footage started landing, Crowley and Benton weren't dealing with a complaint from a random passenger. They were dealing with a documented incident involving a federal officer, multiple recordings, a supervisor who verified legitimacy on scene, and a chief who had already locked down the evidence trail. That's where the real consequences began. Internal Affairs opened the case the same day, not as a courtesy, as a requirement. A takedown in public is already serious. A takedown of a verified federal officer, while comments on camera suggested bias, turns into a liability fire on multiple levels. Chief Daniel Hartman didn't wait for someone else to force his hand. He issued a preservation order for everything tied to the incident. Both body cameras, dispatch audio, written logs, and the airport's fixed surveillance feeds. He also ordered Crowley and Benton to submit their initial statements separately. No hallway coaching. No, let's get our stories straight. That detail mattered. Separation prevents teamwork from turning into narrative building. Crowley's first statement tried to lean on the usual cover language: safety, uncertainty, suspicious behavior. The problem was simple. The footage didn't support it. Reed's posture stayed controlled. His hands stayed visible. He produced credentials early. He repeatedly offered a clean verification process. The video captured it. Benton's statement was worse, in a different way. He didn't own the escalation, but he also didn't distance himself from it. He stayed in the pocket with Crowley the entire time. He helped maintain the detention. He didn't intervene when Crowley's remarks crossed into racial assumptions. That kind of silence becomes its own action when you're wearing a badge. Investigators moved fast because they knew how these cases age. Memory gets convenient, reports get polished, footage stays blunt. They interviewed Moreno first. Moreno confirmed what she saw and what she verified. Reed's marshal credentials and travel documentation checked out immediately, and nothing about Reed's behavior justified forcing him to the floor once credentials were presented. Moreno also documented the crowd presence and confirmed that multiple civilians were recording before she arrived. Then Internal Affairs interviewed Reed. Reed didn't show up emotional. He showed up prepared. He gave a timeline, listed who said what, and identified the exact moment the stop shifted from verification to humiliation. He also provided his official orders and noted the agency contacts who could confirm them. That wasn't posturing. That was Reed making sure the investigation couldn't be steered into vagueness. The federal side didn't wait around either. Once Reed's agency learned what happened, they requested the preserved footage and incident records through formal channels. They also requested any prior complaints tied to Crowley and Benton, including use of force history and bias-related allegations. That's standard when an event suggests a pattern. The department couldn't stall without making it worse. Hartman had already locked the evidence down, so the requests were processed. As the footage got reviewed, the case stopped being about a misunderstanding. The recordings showed how the assumptions formed, how the tone shifted, and how Crowley escalated after being offered verification. The remarks didn't land as accidental. They landed as worldview. That's why they hit so hard when replayed in a quiet room with investigators. Crowley tried to reframe it as instincts. He claimed he couldn't trust credentials on sight. He suggested criminals impersonate officers. He tried to make it sound like he'd been doing the public a favor. Internal Affairs pushed back with the obvious questions. If the concern was impersonation, why reject the offer to verify through dispatch and a supervisor? Why escalate to a takedown with a compliant subject? Why make comments about Reed not matching the role instead of focusing on verification? Why continue after the credentials were presented? The answers didn't come out clean. And by then, the public side was moving too. Bystander videos were spreading. People were tagging the airport department. Comment sections filled up with the same pattern. People saying they'd experienced similar treatment. People arguing about authority. People focusing on the fact that Reed didn't do anything aggressive and still ended up on the floor. That pressure didn't decide the investigation, but it raised the cost of a quiet cover-up. Internal Affairs completed an early findings memo, and it didn't read like a minor policy issue. It read like a failure of judgment, a failure of procedure, and a failure to intervene. Crowley faced the main charge: unreasonable detention and use of force, plus conduct violations tied to the recorded remarks. The department also flagged credibility issues because once an officer's explanations don't match the footage, the damage goes beyond one incident. Courts remember that. Benton faced a different lane: failure to intervene, failure to de-escalate, and failure to report misconduct appropriately. He didn't throw Reed to the ground, but he stood there and helped keep the cuffs on. He watched the train coming and stayed on the tracks. Hartman placed both officers on formal administrative status while the process moved forward. Crowley was already off the street. Benton was too. No back next week. No quiet reassignment to a softer post. Behind the scenes, city attorneys and department counsel got involved because they had to. This wasn't going to be handled with a stern talk and a training reminder. The footage had legal weight, and Reed's career and reputation had been attacked in public. Reed's next move was predictable for someone who understood accountability systems. He retained counsel and filed a civil rights lawsuit alleging unlawful detention, excessive force, and discriminatory treatment. The filing didn't depend on emotion. It depended on evidence, and the evidence was already stacked. Bodycam, bystander video, supervisor verification, chief's preservation order, and internal findings pointing in the same direction. Once the lawsuit hit, Crowley's employment situation became a countdown. Departments can survive accusations. They don't survive footage that contradicts their officer, especially when federal scrutiny is in the mix. Crowley fought it anyway. He appealed internally. He leaned on union representation. He tried to argue procedure. None of it changed what the cameras showed. The department terminated Crowley. After termination, the state-level certification process followed. Decertification isn't a headline word to most people, but inside law enforcement, it's a career ender. It blocks the easy move to another department. It marks you as unfit to serve. Benton didn't get fired, but he didn't walk away clean. The department disciplined him for failing to intervene and for backing an escalation that should have been stopped. His record took the hit, his standing dropped, and his role changed. The message was clear. Being the quiet partner doesn't protect you when you enable misconduct on camera. By the time those employment decisions landed, the lawsuit was already pushing towards the part departments hate most: discovery. Because discovery doesn't care about anyone's pride. It demands documents, training records, prior complaints, and communications. It drags patterns into daylight, and that's exactly where Reed had aimed it. The lawsuit didn't sit in the background. Reed's legal team pushed it forward like they expected the records to tell the real story, because that's usually where these cases either die quietly or explode publicly. Discovery started, and the department had to produce what it had: body cam footage, dispatch logs, supervisor notes, training records, prior complaints tied to Crowley and Benton, use of force reports. Anything connected to how stops and credential verification were supposed to work inside that airport. This wasn't a debate anymore. It was paperwork and video. Reed's team focused on a simple timeline. Credentials presented early, verification offered early. Crowley rejected it. Crowley escalated anyway. Moreno verified within minutes once she arrived. Hartman preserved evidence and pulled the officers. Every step lined up. The department's legal counsel saw the same problem Reed's team saw. A jury wouldn't need special training to understand what happened. A calm, compliant federal officer got forced to the floor while wearing a uniform, and the reason sounded like bias on camera. That's the kind of case that turns into a public lesson. Settlement talks began while the department tried to limit the damage. Reed didn't treat the settlement like a payout. He treated it like a lever. Money mattered because harm happened, but reforms mattered because this wasn't just about him. If the department wanted closure, it needed to change how this could happen again. The final settlement was major, big enough to sting, big enough that leadership couldn't pretend it was nuisance value. Part of the resolution included written terms tied to accountability reforms, not just a check. Then the department had to prove it was serious. Chief Hartman announced a set of changes that hit the exact failure points from the incident. Credential verification protocol. When someone presents law enforcement credentials, officers must verify through dispatch supervisor channels before escalating, unless there's a clear, immediate threat. Stop documentation requirements. Officers must document the specific basis for a stop and any escalation steps with timestamps tied to Bodycam. Duty to intervene policy enforcement. Officers who stand by during misconduct face discipline, not just coaching. Bodycam audit triggers. Certain keywords, complaint types, or use of force patterns automatically trigger a review. Supervisor response standards. A supervisor has to respond quickly when a stop involves credentials, detention, or use of force in a high-visibility public setting. Training upgrades, not feel-good lectures. Scenario-based training built around real footage and correct decision-making under stress. Crowley's outcome stayed final. He was fired, and the certification process ended his ability to hop to another department like nothing happened. That wasn't revenge. That was the system saying he couldn't be trusted with authority. Benton's outcome followed the logic the public usually misses. He didn't get treated as invisible just because Crowley was the loud one. He got disciplined for failing to intervene and for supporting the escalation. His career didn't end, but it changed. Reduced standing, restricted duties, mandatory retraining, and ongoing monitoring. The department wanted it on record that silence isn't neutral. Reed kept working. He didn't become a media personality. He didn't chase attention. He returned to duty with his reputation intact, in the only way that matters. Officially. Quietly. With proof on his side. But the personal cost didn't vanish. People underestimate that part. Being forced to the floor in public while wearing your own badge hits different. It tells you exactly how fast authority can turn on you when someone decides you don't fit the picture in their head. Still, Reed got something most people never get: a clean record of the truth and a system that couldn't erase it. That's the real takeaway here. COM didn't protect Reed by itself. Credentials didn't protect him by themselves. What protected him was documentation, oversight, and supervisors who chose facts over loyalty. Cameras didn't create accountability, but they made it unavoidable. So here's the question for you. If you were standing there watching, would you have pulled your phone out and recorded? Or would you have kept walking and hoped someone else did it? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories where evidence beats arrogance and power trips backfire, like the video and subscribe.
Stay right there. Hands where I can see them. Don't reach for anything.
Understood. Detective Sergeant Marcus Hayes,
Where do you work? What agency?
City, Major Crimes. You can verify me by radio.
Turn around. I'm going to pat you down.
For what reason?
Officer safety. Just do
Got
it.
you covered.
The two patrol officers walked up like they'd just caught a regular guy trying to slip through a traffic stop. They were wrong. The driver was a black detective sergeant in full uniform, sitting in a marked department vehicle, and the longer they kept pushing, the worse it was going to look for them. The moment he calmly identified himself, the whole stop should have ended. Instead, they kept leaning in like they didn't believe him, and after they finally let him go, their own audio picked up the part they never intended anyone to hear. Before we get into it, drop where you're watching from, city and state or country. And if you like stories where people don't lose control, don't beg, and still get accountability through records and procedure, hit like and subscribe. Now, let's rewind. Detective Sergeant Marcus Hayes was driving through St. Louis in a marked unit wearing full uniform. It wasn't a gray area. Anyone looking could see the vehicle belonged to the department, and the man behind the wheel belonged in it. Red and blue lights hit his mirrors. Hayes did what he'd expect from anyone he stopped. He signaled, slowed down, and pulled over safely. He kept his hands where they could be seen. No attitude, no sudden moves. He didn't try to shortcut the moment by shouting who he was from the window. He let the stop play out the way policy says it should. Two officers approached. Tyler Brennan came to the driver's side and took control of the interaction. Jared Alvarado hung back near the passenger side, angled toward the cabin, watching hands and scanning the interior. Standard posture, but not a friendly one. Brennan told Hayes the reason for the stop. The license plate didn't come back to anything. That explanation didn't make sense on its face. The unit had department plates. Even if a system was glitching, the normal response would have been quick verification and a professional reset, especially when the driver was in uniform. Instead of moving to fix the supposed issue, Brennan started asking questions that didn't match the reason for the stop. He wanted to know where Hayes was going. He asked it in a way that sounded less like routine and more like a test. Hayes answered the minimum. He gave his identity and made it clear he was Detective Sergeant Marcus Hayes. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't add extra details. He stayed focused on the stop itself. Brennan didn't accept it right away. He acted like the name didn't land, like the badge didn't land, like the uniform didn't land. Alvarado stayed in position and let Brennan run the stop, but he wasn't correcting it either. He didn't step in to say, "We've got a marked unit," or "Let's verify and clear." He just watched and waited, which told Hayes everything about how this was going to go. Hayes kept his tone even. He repeated who he was and offered what an officer would normally offer in that situation: credentials and verification. Nothing dramatic, nothing confrontational. What made the moment tense wasn't loud voices. It was the gap between what was obvious and how they were acting. A marked police unit. A uniformed detective sergeant. Yet they were still treating him like somebody trying to talk his way out of something. Brennan pressed again with more questions about where Hayes was headed and what he was doing out there. That's the kind of line officers use when they're fishing, trying to turn a basic stop into something bigger, hoping the driver gives them a story they can poke holes in. Hayes didn't give him that. He stayed calm and shifted into a more formal, procedural tone, the kind that signals he's tracking details and thinking ahead. Brennan picked up on it. The energy changed. The stop stopped expanding and started shrinking. A quick check happened. Something got confirmed. Brennan's confidence dropped a notch. Alvarado's posture loosened just slightly. Then the stop ended, not with an apology. Not with a clean explanation for why a marked unit supposedly didn't return in the system. They simply released Hayes and stepped back like they wanted the whole interaction to disappear. Hayes drove off and kept his head straight. He didn't make a scene. He didn't pull a rank show. He didn't chase them down for an argument on the roadside. He handled it the way a detective handles something that feels wrong. He started organizing what he knew, what could be proven, and what would matter later. What Brennan and Alvarado didn't count on was the audio. They spoke after he left like the moment was over and nobody important was listening. The language they used wasn't professional frustration. It was insulting and derogatory, the kind of talk that tells you the stop wasn't just a mistake. Hayes didn't know the exact words yet. He just knew what the stop felt like, and he knew the department's systems would show whether that plate story was real. So he made a decision that was going to set everything in motion. He wasn't going to let them write the narrative first. Hayes didn't go straight into outrage. He went into process. He got back to the district, parked the unit, and sat for a minute before he even stepped out. He replayed the stop in his head, the way detectives do when they're building a timeline. The first approach, the plate claim, the questions about where he was going, the hesitation when he identified himself. None of it matched a simple system error. He did two things that night that separated this from a normal complaint. First, he wrote the basics down while it was fresh. Location, time window. Unit numbers if he caught them. The names if they said them. The exact reason they gave for the stop. He kept it plain and factual because he already knew how this game works. The second emotions show up on paper, people start labeling you angry instead of addressing what happened. Second, he started pulling what the department already had. A traffic stop isn't just two officers and a driver. It's dispatch records, CAD entries, plate queries, GPS pings, body camera status, radio traffic. Even if someone tries to explain it away later, the systems keep timestamps. By the next day, Hayes went through the formal route. He notified his supervisor and requested the stop information through the channels he was supposed to use. No threats, no, do you know who I am? Just a clean report. 2 patrol officers stopped a marked unit driven by an on-duty detective sergeant, claimed the plates didn't return, questioned destination, then released him. What he expected was straightforward. Someone would look at the logs, see the problem, and handle it quietly. What he got was resistance, not open resistance, the kind that hides behind delays and vague answers, the kind where people act like you're making them do extra work by asking for records that should be routine. Then the audio surfaced. It didn't come to him as gossip. It came the way these things always come in a department. Someone who heard it couldn't pretend they didn't hear it. A recording existed from the stop sequence, and after Hayes drove off, the officers were still talking. Their voices weren't careful anymore. The language on that audio wasn't cop stress. It wasn't a harmless complaint about paperwork or a long night. It was insulting and derogatory, aimed at Hayes, said with the confidence of people who believed they'd never face consequences for it. When Hayes listened, he didn't react like someone who wanted revenge. He reacted like someone who just received evidence. He copied the details into his notes. When he heard a name, he wrote it down. When he heard a time marker, he wrote it down. He kept it clinical. He also kept the audio secure because he understood another basic rule. The moment an incident becomes about documentation, people start trying to control what documentation exists. He reported the audio up the chain, too. That's when things shifted from uncomfortable to ugly. Instead of focusing on the officer's conduct, the conversation around Hayes started turning sideways. People didn't say it directly, but the message was clear. Why was he pushing this? Why not let it go? Why not handle it internally, quietly, without making it a thing? Hayes had heard that line before in other cases usually said to civilians. Hearing it aimed at him felt different. He wasn't asking for special treatment. He was asking for basic professional accountability for a stop that shouldn't have happened in the first place. Then the patrol officers started building their version. Brennan and Alvarado didn't just stick with, plates didn't return. Their narrative began to grow. The details started sliding in ways that protected them and put Hayes on the defensive. They hinted he acted like he didn't have to comply. They suggested he gave them attitude. They suggested he escalated the tone. They went for the classic move. If the stop looks wrong, claim the person you stopped made it difficult. The most telling part wasn't even what they claimed. It was how fast it showed up. Hayes heard through internal channels that statements were being gathered and that the framing wasn't neutral. It sounded coordinated, like they'd already agreed on what the story needed to be before anyone asked hard questions about why a marked unit didn't come back in the first place. And then came the part that crossed a line for Hayes. He started getting treated like he was under suspicion. Not formally, not with paperwork in his hand, more like a soft squeeze. Questions about his conduct. Questions about whether he was properly authorized to be in that vehicle at that time. Questions that had nothing to do with the alleged plate issue, but everything to do with flipping the spotlight. That's when Hayes stopped assuming the department would correct itself. He started thinking like a plaintiff. He began requesting the objective pieces, the plate query logs, the CAD timestamps, any Bodycam activation records, unit GPS data, and supervisor notifications. He wasn't asking for opinions. He was asking for systems that don't get nervous and don't forget. He also started looking at the oversight process, because he knew how internal handling can go when the department decides embarrassment is the real threat. The stop itself had ended quickly. The retaliation phase was just beginning. By the time Hayes realized this wasn't going to stay a simple internal complaint, the narrative had already started moving without him. Brennan and Alvarado didn't just file a short explanation and move on. They leaned into a story that made them look proactive and made Hayes look like a problem. Not criminal, just difficult. That word does a lot of work in law enforcement reports. It's a polite label that gives cover for almost anything. Their statements started circling the same points. They claimed the plate return issue was real. They suggested Hayes didn't immediately comply the way a normal driver would. And they implied his demeanor forced them to keep the stop going longer than necessary. Hayes read it and saw the angle instantly. If they could paint him as confrontational, they could justify the stop as officer safety and uncertainty. If they could imply he acted outside policy, they could make the department treat it as an internal personnel issue instead of misconduct by patrol. And then the next move came fast. Someone pushed a misconduct allegation at Hayes. It wasn't a clean, formal charge with clear evidence. It was more like an accusation wrapped in concern, questions about whether he was authorized to be in that unit, whether he was using it for personal reasons, whether he had violated some rule about where he could drive it. It didn't match reality, and Hayes knew it. He also knew why it appeared. It gave the department a reason to focus on him instead of the stop. That's the trick. Shift the topic, make it messy, make it both sides. Hayes didn't take the bait. He didn't start debating it in hallways. He didn't fire off angry texts. He treated it like any other investigation. He started building a clean timeline with hard sources. Dispatch logs mattered. Plate query records mattered. CAD timestamps mattered. GPS pings mattered. Those systems don't care who's mad at who. They just show what happened and when. When he requested those records through internal channels, the pace stayed slow. Pieces came back incomplete. Explanations came back fuzzy. System limitations. Retention schedules. We'll get it to you. That kind of talk. Hayes had been around long enough to know delay isn't always laziness. Sometimes delay is strategy, so he widened the lane. He filed a complaint that didn't rely on friendly cooperation. He moved it into the oversight process. The police oversight board was supposed to be the outside valve, a place where misconduct doesn't get quietly handled by the same building that has to protect its image. Hayes submitted what he had. The basic stop details, the fact he was in full uniform in a marked unit, the plate excuse, the questioning that didn't match the reason, and the audio that captured the officer's language after the stop ended. The board's response wasn't unified. A couple members treated it like what it was, a serious indicator that something deeper was wrong. They asked for records. They asked for reports. They wanted to know why two officers would stop a marked unit and then talk like that after. Other members moved differently. They minimized. They framed it like an unfortunate exchange rather than a questionable stop. They hinted it could be handled internally, which was just another way of saying quietly. Hayes watched it happen and understood the second phase of the game. The stop wasn't only about patrol officers anymore. It was about whether oversight would actually oversee. He also understood something personal. If they were willing to imply he committed misconduct just to justify stopping him, they weren't going to stop at implying. They were going to keep pushing until he backed off or looked unstable. That's when Hayes brought in counsel. He didn't do it as a stunt. He did it because the minute your own department starts floating false allegations about you, you stop assuming good faith. You stop relying on handshake processes. You create consequences for dishonesty. Attorney Dana Whitfield met him with the same energy Hayes brought to cases: detail-focused, calm, and ruthless about documentation. She didn't start with speeches. She started with questions. What exactly was said at the stop? What did the officers claim? What proof exists outside of anyone's memory? Which systems recorded the plate check? Were body cams on? Did supervisors get notified? Who edited what report and when? Then she explained the core problem in simple terms. If Brennan and Alvarado stopped a marked unit based on a claim that couldn't be supported by system logs, that stop looked unlawful. If the questioning strayed into fishing without a legitimate basis, it looked worse. If derogatory language showed bias after the fact, it made motive harder to deny. If they coordinated statements or made inaccurate claims to justify it, that moved from bad stop into cover story. And if an oversight board failed to act properly once evidence was in front of them, they could be pulled into the case too, depending on what they did or didn't do. Hayes wasn't guessing anymore. He and Whitfield started sending formal requests and preserving evidence. Notices went out, records requests tightened. The tone changed because legal paper changes tone. People who ignore internal emails don't ignore discovery. That's when Hayes felt the department shift again. More careful conversations, more guarded looks, less casual support. People who used to greet him like a coworker started treating him like a risk. Brennan and Alvarado also felt it. They weren't dealing with a complaint now. They were dealing with a timeline and an attorney who knew how to compare their written statements against system data. And that's when the decision became obvious. Hayes wasn't going to win this by asking for fairness. He was going to win it by forcing truth into the record. So Whitfield drafted the civil suit. It named Brennan and Alvarado directly. It laid out the stop, the alleged lack of lawful basis, the racial motive indicated by language and conduct, and the aftermath where inaccurate statements and false misconduct claims surfaced to justify what happened. It also targeted members of the oversight board for their role in the handling, aiming straight at accountability beyond the street-level stop. Hayes requested a jury trial and damages, not because he wanted a payday, but because he wanted the one forum where people can't bury the story in internal processes. Once it was filed, the situation stopped being gossip and started being formal. Depositions were coming, records were coming, and anyone who had helped shape the story now had to live with what they put in writing. Once the lawsuit hit, everything got real in a way internal complaints never do. People stopped speaking in vibes and start speaking in documents. Brennan and Alvarado weren't just answering a supervisor anymore. They were about to answer under oath. Whitfield moved fast and stayed narrow. She didn't argue the stop in circles. She built a timeline that either matched the systems or didn't. First came the dispatch and CAD records. Those showed whether a plate was actually run, when it was run, what it returned, and what the officers did next. Plate checks leave footprints. Even when people forget details later, the system doesn't. Then came the report history. If the officers wrote one version first and then edited it after learning Hayes had audio, that mattered. If a supervisor nudged language to make it sound cleaner, that mattered too. Not because edits are always illegal, but because coordinated cleanup looks like consciousness of guilt when the facts don't support the original claim. Body camera status got pulled next. If cameras weren't on, Whitfield didn't treat it like a mystery. She treated it like a question with a policy answer. If cameras were required and weren't activated, that's another problem. If they were activated and the stop audio existed, that's an even bigger problem for the defense. And then the audio became the anchor. Not the whole case, but the part nobody could spin. The stop ended quickly once Hayes identified himself. Yet the officers' language afterward told a different story about what they thought they were doing and why. That's what juries understand instantly. You can debate reasonable suspicion all day. It's hard to debate the mindset revealed when someone thinks the moment is private. Depositions followed. Brennan went first. He tried to hold the line. Plate didn't return. Uncertainty. Officer safety. Routine questions. Whitfield didn't bite on broad claims. She kept him pinned to specifics. What time did he run the plate? Which system? What exactly did it return? Why did he question a uniformed detective sergeant in a marked unit as if he was a stranger? Why did the story later include accusations about Hayes' behavior when the stop ended without any enforcement action? Alvarado's deposition mattered just as much, because "I was just there" doesn't work when you back a narrative. He tried to present himself as cautious and professional, but he had the same problem. His account had to match the records and had to explain why nobody verified Hayes cleanly and moved on. The retaliation piece started collapsing under that pressure. Those misconduct insinuations about Hayes, they didn't hold up when compared against duty status, vehicle authorization, and routine department practice. The false framing looked like what it was: a counter-accusation designed to make Hayes the issue. The oversight board got pulled in next. Some members tried to hide behind process. They suggested they deferred to internal channels, that they didn't have enough information, that timing complicated things. Whitfield didn't argue about feelings. She asked what actions were taken once evidence was presented. What was requested? What was reviewed? What was ignored? Who communicated with whom? Who delayed what? That's where the pressure shifted beyond the two patrol officers. Because even if Brennan and Alvarado started this, a system can still choose transparency or choose protection. The board's job was to be the outside check. If they acted like a shield instead, that became part of the story. Short-term consequences landed first. Brennan and Alvarado didn't keep moving like nothing happened. Their assignments changed. Supervision tightened. People inside the department got quieter around them. Not because the department suddenly found its morals, but because lawsuits create risk and risk creates control. Policy discussions started too. Plate checks, stops involving marked units, required verification steps, Bodycam activation discipline. Those conversations don't happen because leadership suddenly cares. They happen because a timeline exists and it's embarrassing. Hayes felt the blowback anyway. Some coworkers treated him like he broke an unwritten rule by making it public. Others quietly supported him but didn't want their names near it. That's common. Most people don't want to be brave when they've got bills and a job. Hayes kept doing the same thing he did at the stop. He stayed clean, no messy public statements, no social media war, no trying to be a celebrity. He let the records do the talking. As the case moved forward, the city faced a choice: fight it at trial and risk a jury hearing the audio and seeing the contradictions, or resolve it with money and policy changes while trying to control the headline. Either way, Brennan and Alvarado couldn't outrun the core facts. They stopped a marked unit driven by a uniformed black detective sergeant using a plate excuse that didn't match how the system normally works, then spoke in a way that made bias hard to deny, then helped create a story that tried to flip misconduct onto Hayes. And Hayes couldn't unlive the lesson either. The uniform didn't protect him from being treated like a suspect. The badge didn't protect him from being doubted by people who should have known better. The only thing that protected him was discipline, documentation, staying calm, not giving them a reaction to use. That's what made the outcome bigger than one stop. It wasn't just about two officers making a bad decision on a roadway. It was about what happens when a person refuses to let the system rewrite reality. Hayes didn't win by yelling. He didn't win by threatening. He won by locking the facts in place until everyone involved had to deal with them. So, here's the question for you. If you were in Hayes' seat, would you have reported it and pushed it all the way, even knowing it could make work uncomfortable? Or would you have let it slide because it ended quickly? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you've been through something like this, at work, in school, anywhere, share what happened. Somebody reading needs that. And if you want more story times where accountability actually lands, like the video, subscribe, and stay here.
Why are you inside a closed business?
I own it. I'm closing out the register and locking up inventory.
Show me proof, now.
My license and permits are on the wall behind me.
That doesn't mean anything.
It's my business. It literally means everything.
Turn around.
Please, just verify it. Run the address.
Call dispatch.
Officer Derek Holt stepped into the electronics shop after hours with the posture of a man who'd already decided what he was looking at. His hand hovered near his weapon. His eyes went straight to the open cash drawer, then the back hallway, then Evan Carter behind the counter. Holt treated the scene like a crime in progress. Evan treated it like a misunderstanding that should end quickly if basic facts got checked. Holt demanded to know why someone was inside a closed business. Evan explained he owned the place and he was finishing close-out tasks, counting the drawer, logging receipts, and locking up inventory for the night. Evan kept his hands visible and didn't move fast, because he knew exactly how quickly small things get misread in moments like this. Holt didn't slow down. He pressed harder, as if each answer was just another excuse. Evan showed his ID. Holt barely looked at it. Evan pointed to the wall behind the counter, where the business license and permits were displayed with Evan's name on them. Holt didn't step in to read them. He acted like verification was optional. That's the first sign this was going to go bad. When the easiest proof sits right in front of someone and they refuse to even look, the goal usually isn't the truth, it's control. Quick pause. Where are you watching from? Drop your state or country in the comments. And if you watch stories where cameras and paperwork expose abuse of power, hit like and subscribe, because this one ends with a settlement and a badge getting taken away. Now here's how it started. Evan ran a small electronics repair shop in a strip mall. Nothing fancy. He fixed phones, laptops, tablets, game consoles, and whatever else people couldn't afford to replace. The shop stayed afloat because Evan did two things consistently: good work and tight routines. Closing time didn't mean he walked out the second the doors locked. He stayed to finish the stuff that keeps a small business alive. He counted cash, logged receipts, sealed deposits, checked work orders, and secured customer devices. That inventory mattered. One mistake could turn into angry customers, chargebacks, or insurance headaches. On this night, the closed sign was up. The front door was locked. Evan was still inside under the bright lights, focused on the end-of-day process. Everything was normal on his side of that counter. Outside, Holt drove by and saw the lights. Holt didn't call it in as a quick welfare check. He didn't approach like someone trying to confirm whether the owner was inside finishing up. He treated light in a storefront like a burglary signal and moved like he wanted the first move. Once Holt was inside, he questioned Evan like Evan had been caught mid-act. Evan kept trying to bring it back to verifiable facts. Ownership, ID, license wall, permits, the address, the business name, everything that could be checked in under a minute. Holt kept rejecting every off-ramp. Evan suggested Holt run the information and confirm it with dispatch. Holt did run Evan. The check came back clean. No warrants, No flags. Nothing that supported the idea Evan was breaking into anything. A normal officer ends it there, apologizes, and leaves. Holt didn't. He switched lanes without admitting it. Suddenly, it wasn't just burglary. Now he treated it like trespassing. Now he acted like Evan being inside after hours needed permission, even though Evan had just explained he owned the place. Evan pointed again to the documents on the wall. He mentioned there was mail addressed to him at that business. He offered to show keys and lease paperwork. Holt didn't respond like a person weighing evidence. He responded like a person protecting a decision. Then Holt took out handcuffs. Evan didn't resist because Evan understood the math. Arguing on the spot can turn a bad decision into a dangerous one. He stayed controlled, kept his body language steady, and let Holt do what Holt clearly came to do. Holt walked him towards the front door and out into public view, right in front of the storefront, like Evan had been caught stealing from his own livelihood. Meanwhile, multiple security cameras kept recording everything from angles Holt wasn't thinking about. Holt didn't just arrest Evan, he made it visible. He guided Evan along the storefront windows and out into the strip mall's open space, where anyone passing could see cuffs on the shop owner. Cars rolled by on the main road. A couple people slowed down. One person walking toward the nail salon hesitated and stared. Holt didn't try to keep it quiet. He looked like he wanted the scene to confirm his assumption. Evan stayed controlled. He didn't pull away. He didn't argue in a way that could be twisted into resisting. He kept repeating the same simple facts, and Holt kept treating those facts like a story Evan made up 5 seconds ago. Holt positioned Evan near the curb like it was safer for him and more humiliating for Evan. Then he started asking questions again, questions Evan had already answered inside, only now the goal was different. Holt wanted Evan to contradict himself. He wanted a slip. He wanted anything he could write later to justify what he'd already done. Evan didn't give him that. Evan directed Holt back to the most basic proof: the license wall inside the shop with Evan's name, the permits, the shop mail, the keys, the alarm code, the business records. All things a reasonable officer could verify without drama. Holt didn't verify, he stalled. He talked like the decision was already made and the paperwork would catch up. Then the second unit rolled in. Officer Maya Ramirez stepped out and read the scene the way experienced cops do, quickly, quietly, and with her eyes open. She didn't start with the story Holt was telling. She started with the obvious question: what's the cleanest way to confirm who belongs here? Ramirez walked into the shop while Holt stayed outside with Evan. That choice mattered. It removed the ego contest from the verification step. It also put Ramirez in front of the evidence Holt had refused to even look at. Inside, the proof wasn't subtle. The business license and permits were posted where customers could see them, with Evan's name on them. Mail sat behind the counter, addressed to Evan at that business address. There were printed photos near the register from the shop's opening day, the kind owners put up when they're proud of what they built. Evan's face was in those photos, in that exact shop, behind that exact counter. Ramirez didn't need a long investigation. She needed eyes. She came back outside and told Holt what she saw. She didn't posture. She didn't argue like it was personal. She gave him the simple reality. The owner's documentation was on the wall, and the shop had plenty of indicators that Evan belonged there. Holt didn't accept the correction. He reacted the way people react when they've put their pride into the wrong decision. He tried to hold the line. He treated Ramirez's observations like they were irrelevant. He kept pushing the suspected burglary angle, even though nothing in the shop looked disturbed and even though Evan's information had already come back clean. Ramirez didn't match Holt's tone. She stayed professional, but she also didn't join the fantasy. That created the first visible split. One officer stuck an assumption. One officer using verification like she was trained to do. Holt made a move to end the debate the way he wanted by removing Evan from the scene. He put Evan in the patrol car anyway. Evan watched the shop through the window as Holt shut the door. That was the real gut punch. The place Evan built with long nights and careful routines was now being treated like a crime scene, and he couldn't even stand inside it to protect it. While Holt started the process to transport, Ramirez stayed back for a moment. She looked up at the security cameras. There were several. Not hidden, not subtle. They pointed directly at the counter, the entry, the back hallway, and the front windows. Ramirez already knew what that meant. Whatever Holt said later would have to match what the cameras recorded. Holt drove Evan to the station. Evan sat cuffed in the back, while Holt built his narrative out loud through radio updates and short explanations to anyone who'd listen. He framed Evan as a suspicious person caught inside after hours. He avoided the parts that didn't help him, like the posted license, the mail, the photos, and the clean check. At the station, the confidence dropped. Not because Holt suddenly grew a conscience, because other people were present, and Holt couldn't control what they saw. A desk sergeant at the front recognized Evan before Holt even finished the intake explanation. Evan wasn't a stranger downtown. He'd fixed phones for half the block. He'd done quick repairs for city staff. He'd built a reputation by being consistent, not flashy. The sergeant asked what this was about, and Holt tried to keep it simple. After-hours business, suspected burglary, trespassing. The sergeant didn't buy it on faith. He asked for the basics: identification, address, proof, reasonable cause. Ramirez arrived not long after, and she didn't come empty-handed. She came with what Holt should have checked at the start: the posted license, the mail, and the fact that the shop's cameras captured everything. That shifted the room. Because now the issue wasn't whether Evan could prove ownership. It was why Holt refused to verify it. Leadership pulled the footage. They didn't need a full compilation. They needed minutes. The video showed Holt entering hot, refusing to read the license, dismissing Evan's ID, and escalating even after the system check came back clean. It also showed Evan staying calm and compliant the whole time. That's when orders came down to remove the cuffs. Evan got uncuffed inside the station, not out of kindness, but because keeping him restrained after seeing that footage would have been reckless. The desk sergeant made it clear this wasn't going to be handled as a normal arrest that just got sorted out later. Holt stood there while the situation flipped on him in real time. Evan didn't celebrate. He didn't need to. The cameras already did the talking. By the next morning, Evan wasn't just dealing with embarrassment. He was dealing with risk. His shop had been left in a weird limbo the night before, and now he had to clean up the mess Holt created. Customers with devices inside, late-night security logs, and the question every small business owner hates: what else did that officer touch, move, or claim happened? Evan handled it the same way he handled repairs. Evidence first, timeline second. Emote CI later. He pulled the security footage as soon as he got back to the shop. Not one angle. All of them. Front door camera. Counter camera. Back hallway camera. The exterior camera that captured Holt walking him out in cuffs like Evan was a suspect pulled from a crime scene. The footage didn't make Evan look good. It made Holt look reckless. It showed Holt entering with suspicion already locked in, refusing to read the posted license, dismissing the ID, and escalating after the system check came back clean. It also showed Evan doing the exact thing departments always claim they want: calm, compliant, hands visible, offering verification. That video gave Evan something most people don't get: a clean record of the whole decision chain. Evan called an attorney that afternoon. Not a friend of a friend, not somebody who handles everything. A civil rights lawyer who knew what mattered: unlawful seizure, false arrest, and the way I thought falls apart when you ignore obvious proof. While the legal side started moving, the public side started moving too, because someone outside the shop had filmed a short clip during the cuff walk. It wasn't the full story. It didn't need to be. It showed Evan in cuffs in front of his own storefront, and it showed Holt acting like he'd just solved a crime. That clip hit social media first. Then people asked for context. Then Evan's attorney advised him on how to release the footage safely without messing up the case. Once the full security video went out, the argument ended. People didn't have to guess what happened. They watched it. They watched Holt ignore the license wall. They watched him keep pushing even after verification came back clean. They watched him force the situation into an arrest anyway. And the comments all landed on the same point. This wasn't confusion. This was refusal. Local news picked it up fast. Then bigger accounts reposted it. Then national outlets started sniffing around because a cop arresting a business owner inside his own shop is the kind of story that travels. Inside the department, leadership didn't treat it like a PR inconvenience. They treated it like a liability grenade. Internal Affairs opened the review, and not just for tone or attitude. The question was direct. Why did Holt arrest a man for trespassing in a business that clearly belonged to him, after checking his information and seeing proof in plain sight? That's when Holt's history stopped being background noise and became relevant. Complaints that had been brushed off as misunderstandings suddenly looked like a pattern when the department had video showing the same behavior: escalation, dismissing explanations, refusing basic verification, then writing it up like the civilian forced his hand. Internal Affairs didn't need to guess what Holt would say. They already knew the defense script: officer safety, suspicion, training, split-second decisions. The problem was Holt didn't make a split-second decision. He made a series of decisions, and each one had an easy off-ramp he ignored. By the end of that week, Holt was on administrative leave. The department didn't announce it with a big speech. They kept it tight. The video was doing enough talking. Evan's lawsuit hit next, filed in federal court with a clean narrative. Evan was seized and arrested without probable cause, despite clear proof of ownership, and the officer refused to verify facts that were immediately available. That legal move forced the city into a corner. Because once a federal civil rights case is filed, the city's lawyers don't argue feelings. They argue facts, policies, and exposure. And the facts were brutal. The city requested records. Internal Affairs requested more records. Suddenly, Holt wasn't just the guy in one viral video. He was a name attached to multiple prior incidents. And now every one of those incidents looked like it needed a second look. Evan also started getting support from the community in a way that wasn't performative. Customers showed up the next day just to spend money there. People left reviews describing Evan as professional and steady. Local business owners offered help. A neighboring shop printed a sign telling people to support Evan's store. That part mattered, not because it fixed the arrest, because it took away the damage Holt tried to cause with public humiliation. Holt tried to defend himself through internal channels, but the video didn't allow the usual wiggle room. He couldn't claim Evan was aggressive. The footage showed Evan controlled. He couldn't claim there was no proof. The license wall and shop materials were visible. He couldn't claim he verified, and it didn't match. Dispatch came back clean. So the defense narrowed to one thing: Holt insisting he still believed something was wrong. That belief wasn't a legal standard. By the time the city sat down to discuss settlement, the conversation wasn't, "Did this happen?" It was, "How much will it cost if we lose in open court?" And this case was the kind cities don't want juries to see. The city didn't drag this out, because dragging it out would have been worse. Once Evan's attorney filed the federal civil rights case, the city's legal department had to evaluate the same thing every risk manager looks at: what a jury would do with clear video, clear proof of ownership, and a clean dispatch check that got ignored. The answer wasn't complicated. They started talking settlement early, not because they suddenly cared about Evan's dignity, because the case was indefensible on camera, and every extra month would add attorney fees, bad press, and more documents coming out in discovery. Evan's team focused on concrete damage, lost time, lost business, emotional distress, the public humiliation, the fact that he got arrested inside his own workplace after offering multiple ways to verify ownership. The footage made the timeline simple, and it made the decision points unavoidable. Then Internal Affairs finished digging. Holt's record mattered now in a way it never had before. Complaints that used to get treated like, he's just aggressive, started lining up into something more consistent, refusing basic verification, escalating when corrected, and writing reports that didn't match what others observed. Leadership couldn't shrug it off this time, because the public already saw the clearest example. The department suspended Holt while the investigation ran. It wasn't a friendly suspension. It was containment. Keep him off the street. Stop the damage from multiplying. The next step was termination, and it didn't land like a shock inside the building. A lot of officers had already watched the footage. They knew what it showed. They also knew what it meant for their jobs when one person's ego turns into a lawsuit the city can't win. Holt lost his law enforcement career the same way he ran that call, by refusing to verify, refusing to adjust, and refusing to accept being wrong. Now the money. The city settled for $400,000 because there was no smart alternative. Going to trial would have put Holt's full history under a microscope, and it would have forced city attorneys to defend the idea that an officer can ignore obvious proof and still claim it was reasonable. That argument doesn't survive a jury that can see the whole thing in high definition. Evan didn't walk away calling it a victory. He called it accountability with a price tag. He used part of the settlement in a way that made sense for him. He expanded the shop instead of hiding from what happened. He upgraded security. He added better exterior lighting. He hired help so closing alone late at night wasn't his normal routine anymore. He also set up clearer after-hours signage, not because he owed anyone an explanation, but because he was done letting assumptions run his life. The community response stayed strong. People didn't just post, they showed up. They brought business. They recommended him to friends. They left reviews that made it clear the shop wasn't going anywhere. Other local owners reached out, partly to support Evan, and partly because they recognized the bigger issue. If this could happen to him, with licenses on the wall and cameras running, it could happen to anyone with the wrong officer on the wrong night. The department tried to control the narrative at first. Standard language, standard statements, nothing specific. That didn't work. So leadership did the only thing that could reduce the damage long term. They turned the footage into training material. Not as entertainment, as a warning, a step-by-step breakdown of what not to do. That video didn't just cost one officer his job. It changed how supervisors talked about stops and detentions and roll call. It gave younger officers a real example of how fast a bad decision becomes a federal case. It also gave civilians something rare. A moment where the system couldn't pretend it didn't see the problem. Evan kept his head down and kept building. He didn't become a public figure. He became what he already was, just louder in one way. He stopped accepting "sort it out later" as a normal response to rights violations. That's the lesson here. This whole thing started because one officer saw lights on and decided the story before checking the facts. Evan didn't win by getting lucky. He won by staying calm, keeping everything on record, and having cameras that didn't blink when a badge stopped listening. So let me ask you, if you were Evan, would you have stayed as calm as he did? Or would you have snapped the moment the officer ignored your license on the wall? Drop your take in the comments. And if you've ever dealt with someone in power who refused to verify the simplest facts, share this with someone who needs to see how accountability actually happens. And if you want more real, grounded stories, where rights receipts and recordings expose abuse of power, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one.
Ma'am, step back. Your kid is a thief.
Who reported a theft? What was taken?
He fits the description. I know what I saw.
A description from who?
You still haven't named a complainant. He's 10 years old. You're restraining a child with no victim in front of you and nothing recovered.
I know. Stay right here with me.
This mall officer walked in thinking he was about to bag an easy confession from a kid he'd already decided was guilty. What he didn't know was that the boy's mother wasn't the kind of person you could intimidate into silence. She was a federal judge. And when she stepped into frame, the whole situation flipped from security doing its job to a documented example of unlawful profiling on a minor. Before we get into it, tell us where you're watching from, your state or country. And if you stick around for stories where cameras force accountability in real time, hit like and subscribe. This one turned into a public lesson because everything was recorded. The body camera footage started in a busy corridor near the food court. It was the part of the mall where people always slowed down. Bags in hand, kids asking for snacks, shoppers stopping to check receipts. A bench sat along the wall, and several groups had set shopping bags nearby while they looked through their purchases. Malik Carter, 10 years old, stood a few feet from that bench. He wasn't crouched over anyone's things. He wasn't reaching into bags. He looked like a kid waiting for an adult to come back. Hands close to his sides, attention bouncing between the crowd and the storefronts. Officer Brent Halverson entered the scene already locked in. He didn't scan the area for a complainant. He didn't ask nearby shoppers if anything was missing. He came straight to Malik and treated him like the crime had already been confirmed. The officer began accusing the child of pickpocketing. No victim got identified on camera. No missing item got described. Nothing was recovered. The reason stayed vague, built on Malik's proximity to bags and the officer's assumptions about who looked like a thief. Then the language slipped out. Not subtle, not accidental. The officer repeatedly used your type and you people while pressing the boy. That matters because it showed what the stop was really based on, not evidence. A category in the officer's head. Malik reacted the way a lot of kids react when an adult with authority corners them in public. He looked scared and confused, trying to answer while also trying not to make the situation worse. He kept insisting he hadn't taken anything, but the officer didn't slow down to actually verify whether a theft had even happened. That's when the officer's approach started to look less like an investigation and more like a squeeze. He kept pushing for an admission. He framed it like Malik only had one way out, agreeing with the accusation. Naomi Carter, Malik's mother, came into view from the side. She'd been a short distance away grabbing a drink and a small bag from a kiosk. From the moment she noticed the officer crowding her son, her pace changed. She didn't rush in wildly. She moved with purpose, stepping close enough to place herself between Malik and the officer's forward angle without touching anyone. Her first move wasn't emotion, it was structure. She challenged the accusation by asking for the basics any reasonable person would ask for. She wanted to know who reported the pickpocketing. She asked what exactly was taken. She asked where the alleged victim was. She asked what evidence the officer had that Malik did anything at all. The officer didn't give clean answers because there weren't clean answers to give. He leaned on the same general suspicion and tried to treat her questions like she was interfering. His tone hardened. He repeated the same biased framing, suggesting Malik fit a type, using that you people language again like it was normal. Naomi didn't mirror his volume. She stayed controlled and kept pulling the conversation back to facts. A missing wallet has an owner. A theft has a complainant. A detention needs legal grounds. None of that appeared on the footage. As the questioning tightened around him, the officer changed tactics. He shifted from trying to argue to trying to control the scene physically. The body cam captured his hand reaching out and closing around Malik's wrist. It wasn't a guiding touch. It was a holding grip, meant to prevent the child from moving away. Malik visibly tensed, shoulders up, body stiff, eyes wide. People nearby started paying attention. A couple of bystanders slowed down. At least one phone came up, pointed directly at the officer and the child. Naomi immediately demanded the officer release her son. She didn't threaten. She didn't plead. She gave a clear instruction and kept her focus on the fact that Malik was 10 years old and was being restrained without an identified victim or any recovered property. The officer refused to let go. Instead, he escalated again, framing it as a detention and acting like the lack of evidence didn't matter because his suspicion was enough. Then his free hand moved toward his belt, and the camera angle made it obvious what he was reaching for. Handcuffs. Not because he had probable cause. Not because a victim stood there pointing at Malik. Not because property had been found. It was a pressure move, aimed at a scared child and a mother who wouldn't back down. Naomi didn't step back. She also didn't give him anything to twist into resisting. Her posture stayed firm. Her questions stayed focused. Meanwhile, you could see bystanders committing to recording, because everyone could feel the line had been crossed. And that's where part 1 ends. An officer holding a 10-year-old by the wrist with cuffs coming out, no victim in sight, no evidence on hand, and a mother who's clearly building a record, calmly, deliberately, because she already knows how accountability actually works. The officer kept Malik's wrist locked while Naomi stood close enough to shield her son without touching the officer. The camera picked up her voice, staying steady, and that steadiness did something important. It forced the chaos to look like what it really was. A grown man restraining a 10-year-old with no clear reason. Naomi stayed on the same track. She kept asking for the complainant. She asked for the missing property. She asked for a description that existed before Malik got singled out. She asked what specific action the officer saw that justified grabbing a child. The officer couldn't anchor the stop to anything real, so he leaned harder on attitude and intimidation. He talked like he was doing Naomi a favor by handling it quietly. He framed her questions as obstruction. He acted like she should be grateful he hadn't taken this further. Meanwhile, the only person who had taken it further was him. The "your type" and "you people" language came back again while he tried to justify why Malik stood out to him. He didn't describe behavior. He described a category. That's what made nearby shoppers start paying attention in a different way. People weren't just curious anymore. They looked concerned. A woman near the bench raised her phone higher. Another bystander stepped into the edge of the frame and stayed there watching the officer's hands. A man with shopping bags slowed down and didn't move on. You could tell the crowd sensed the moment turning. Naomi noticed it too. She didn't play to the audience, but she used the presence of witnesses the right way. She kept her words tight and factual, like she was building a record that would hold up later, even if someone tried to twist it. She made it clear Malik wasn't leaving with the officer unless the officer could explain the legal grounds. She pointed out that there was still no identified victim. She highlighted that no stolen item had been recovered. She flagged that Malik's age mattered because this wasn't an adult being stopped for a verified report. This was a child being pressured to confess to something unconfirmed. The officer's response was to squeeze for compliance. His grip on Malik didn't loosen. He shifted his stance to angle Malik away from his mother, like he wanted to separate them by inches at a time. His free hand hovered at his belt again, and the body cam captured him touching the handcuff case, like he wanted Naomi to see it. That's not procedure. That's theater. Malik started to look at his mother instead of the officer, like he was searching for the right way to behave. Kids do that when they feel trapped. His body stayed stiff, and he tried to keep his hands visible, like he'd learned somewhere that visible hands keep adults calmer. Naomi kept control of her tone, but she didn't soften her boundary. She demanded the officer release Malik's wrist. She repeated that a detention without a victim, without property, and without a clear report was unlawful. She reminded him that he didn't get to invent probable cause out of a guess and then use cuffs to force a confession. The officer didn't like that word, unlawful. His face tightened. His voice rose. He tried to flip it into a power contest, insisting he had authority and that Naomi needed to step back. He kept framing Malik as suspicious, and he kept talking like suspicion itself was the evidence. That's when Naomi changed tactics slightly. Still calm, still controlled. She stopped chasing his answers and started anchoring the moment to accountability. She told him She wanted his name and badge number for the report. She told him to preserve the body cam footage. She told him to call a supervisor immediately, not later. Immediately. That request hit him differently because it wasn't emotional. It wasn't a plea. It sounded like someone used to oversight. The officer hesitated for the first time. You could see it. A tiny pause, a quick glance around, the awareness that phones were up and people weren't walking away anymore. He tried to regain momentum by escalating again. He started to pull the handcuffs out fully, bringing them into view. He used them like a lever, like showing metal would make Malik crumble and Naomi back off. Instead, the opposite happened. A bystander spoke up from off camera, loud enough that the body cam caught it, calling attention to the fact that Malik was a child and asking what the evidence actually was. Another voice said they had the whole thing recorded. The crowd energy shifted from watching to documenting. Naomi stayed focused. She didn't argue with bystanders. She didn't let the situation scatter. Her attention stayed on the officer's hands, the wrist grip, the cuffs, and the fact that he still couldn't point to a victim. Then the officer made the mistake that ended any chance of him playing this off later. He repeated the biased language again, even more openly, while justifying why Malik was the one he stopped. He tried to dress it up as experience, but it landed like pure prejudice on camera in front of witnesses, while he held a 10-year-old. Naomi didn't react with outrage. She reacted like someone confirming a final detail. Her posture straightened. Her voice stayed even. She stopped negotiating and moved into command mode. The cuffs were out now. Not on Malik yet, but close enough that everyone understood what the officer wanted. Fear, compliance, a confession he could write down and call it resolved. Naomi didn't raise her voice. She didn't step into the officer. She didn't touch his equipment. She just tightened the frame of the situation so it couldn't be spun later. She told him again to release Malik's wrist. She reminded him again that there was no identified victim and no recovered property. She pointed out again that he still hadn't described a specific theft report, only his personal suspicion. The officer tried to bulldoze past that. He kept talking like Naomi's refusal to accept his assumption was the real problem. He leaned on authority words and implied consequences if she didn't cooperate. He also kept referring to Malik in group terms, like Malik didn't get to be an individual child, only a stereotype. That your type, you people framing stayed in the audio, clear as day. And you could feel the crowd locking in. Phones stayed raised. People stopped pretending they weren't watching. Someone moved to the side for a better angle. Another person stayed near the bench, eyes on the officer's hands, ready to speak up. If he tried to drag Malik away, the officer noticed the cameras and, instead of backing off, he tried to control the narrative. He started talking like he was doing the right thing and keeping them all safe. He framed Malik as suspicious because he was near bags. He implied Malik must have been working the crowd. Still no victim. Still no missing item. Still nothing tangible. Naomi shifted her attention to pure procedure. She demanded a supervisor again. She demanded the officer's full name and ID again. She made it clear she wanted an incident report filed and the body cam preserved. She said it like it wasn't a request. It was a directive. That's when the officer tried to end it the way he wanted. He tightened his grip on Malik's wrist and angled the cuffs forward like he was about to put them on. Not because he had legal grounds, but because he wanted to force Naomi to either submit or cause a scene. Either way, he thought he'd win. He misread her. Naomi didn't flinch. She didn't argue about his feelings. She didn't threaten him with vague connections. She did something sharper. She identified herself. Calmly, clearly, she stated she was a federal judge. Then she laid out the problem in plain terms. He was profiling a minor, detaining a 10-year-old without an identified victim, without recovered property, and without lawful grounds. She told him to release her son immediately. No yelling, no theatrics, just a statement of role and a statement of law. That's the moment the officer's whole body language changed. The cuffs stopped moving forward. His shoulders shifted. His head turned slightly, like his brain was suddenly running a different calculation. He glanced towards the phones around him, then back to Naomi. You could see him realizing he wasn't in control of the story anymore. He tried to talk his way out fast. He started reframing it as a misunderstanding. He implied he was just checking. He softened his tone and tried to make it sound like he'd never been aggressive at all. The video didn't support that. The grip on Malik's wrist had been steady for too long. The biased language had been said too many times. The cuffs had been out. Everyone saw it. Naomi didn't let him rewrite it in real time. She repeated the instruction. Release Malik. She also demanded the supervisor now, not after the fact. She told him to step back and stop engaging with her child. The officer finally loosened his hand and let go of Malik's wrist. Malik stepped closer to his mother immediately, staying tight to her side. His breathing looked shallow. He didn't look like a kid who'd just been checked. He looked like a kid who'd just been scared on purpose. A bystander spoke loud enough for the body cam to catch that they had the whole interaction recorded. Another person said the biased language was on video too. The officer heard it. You could see it hit him. He started trying to clean up the scene by lowering his voice and looking around as if he was searching for a victim to appear and validate him. Nobody stepped forward. Nobody claimed anything was missing. No one pointed at Malik. The supervisor arrived a minute later, stepping into frame with that "what's going on" posture. Already too late. Naomi gave a short, controlled summary. A detention of a minor, no victim, no property, biased language, physical restraint, cuffs displayed. The supervisor didn't argue on camera. He didn't want to. Not with phones rolling and a federal judge standing there holding her child. The officer tried one more time to minimize it, but his own footage boxed him in. Naomi requested the incident number. She requested the officer's information. She requested confirmation that the body cam would be preserved. She made it clear she'd be filing formal complaints with the mall, the security contractor, and the appropriate oversight channels. Then, she walked Malik away. Not rushed, not dramatic, just done. And right there, you could tell the officer knew something else, too. This wasn't staying in the mall. By the time Naomi and Malik reached the escalator, 3 different phones had already uploaded clips, not later that night. Right then. The kind of quick post that spreads because it's short, clear, and ugly in the simplest way. An adult restraining a 10-year-old with cuffs out, while using "your type, you people" language on camera. Within hours, the video hit local community pages. Then bigger accounts picked it up. People didn't need a long explanation. The footage explained itself. The mall tried to get ahead of it with a bland statement about safety and taking all concerns seriously. That didn't land. The problem wasn't that the officer asked a question. The problem was everything he did after he couldn't support the accusation. The security contractor reacted next. First move was damage control. They said they'd review the incident. They used careful wording. Meanwhile, the clip kept moving. What made this blow up wasn't Naomi's title, even though that's what the headlines latched onto. It was how clean the evidence was. No victim appeared. Nothing was recovered. The officer started from a vague suspicion and never built anything real. He escalated anyway. He grabbed a child. He brought cuffs into the moment. He used biased language more than once. And all of it was recorded. Naomi didn't go looking for attention. She handled it the way someone does when they know oversight exists and expects it to function. She filed formal complaints with mall management and the security company, and she pushed to preserve everything: the full body cam file, nearby mall cameras, security office footage, the entire timeline. She didn't rely on the viral clip alone. She locked down the record. The company placed Officer Halverson on leave quickly, because keeping him on shift would have been reckless. After that, the internal review turned into a detailed, time-stamped breakdown. They tracked what he claimed to see, what he actually verified, what he said, when he made physical contact, and what he used to justify pulling cuffs on a 10-year-old without a complainant in sight. Then they pulled his history. That's when it stopped being a single bad stop. Similar complaints showed up with the same shape, aggressive approaches, vague suspicion, people reporting biased tone, parents describing how quickly he escalated. Some of those complaints had been brushed off before because there wasn't enough proof. This time there was. The company considered the usual exit ramps, the kind of soft response that makes things go away quietly. That idea didn't survive once lawyers and liability entered the room. A child being restrained without grounds, with biased language on camera, isn't something you patch with a training reminder. So the outcome moved straight. He stayed on leave through the review, and then he was terminated. Not a quiet reassignment, not a mutual agreement. Fired because the footage made it impossible to defend his choices. After that, the mall announced changes because the public pressure didn't fade. They tightened detention standards so an officer couldn't grab someone based on a feeling. They set clearer rules around minors. They made supervisors mandatory in certain situations. They pushed de-escalation harder. They also emphasized Bodycam compliance, because everybody had just watched what happens when cameras are on and someone still chooses to act reckless. For Naomi and Malik, the aftermath looked different. Malik had to process that an adult treated him like a suspect for standing near bags. Naomi kept his world steady while she handled the official side. She didn't turn her kid into a spectacle. She focused on making sure the record led to consequences, not excuses. That's the real lesson people took from it. Suspicion isn't proof. Proximity isn't guilt. And when someone in authority decides to gamble on prejudice, video is what forces the truth to stay in place long enough for accountability to catch up. What would you have done in Naomi's position? Would you have started filming immediately? Would you have demanded a supervisor right away? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you've seen